Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for coming over lunch. This is a bit of a redemptive talk for me. So Jane, I don't know if you remember this, but the first time I was invited to give one of these, I was confused and thought it was like just a seminar and everyone had read my paper and we were going to, have a chat about the paper, and then I realized like, no, it's a talk, and I had no slides and just talked off the top of my head for an hour, and it felt like a train wreck to me. So I'm really glad to have the chance to redeem myself and actually give you guys a talk with slides that's prepared and thought out more than 30 seconds in advance. So yeah, thanks again for having me. So some of the work I'll talk about today is some of the papers that I've written with a former mentor and collaborator of mine, Nikolai Morar, who's in environmental studies at the University of Oregon. And so I'll summarize some of the stuff that we've done together in this talk, and then conclude with some remarks and thoughts about how the One Health paradigm in general should be thinking about or dealing with this explosion of interest and funding in artificial intelligence and digital health. So it'll be sort of a summary of some of the older work with some ideas about directions for future work. So in the background of this talk is an idea that I was very much influenced by during my PhD and continue to be, and that's this idea of the extended phenotype that's largely due to Richard Dawkins, right? So in the introduction to his book, The Extended Phenotype, he says, "What I'm advocating for is a point of view, a way of looking at familiar facts and ideas, and a way of asking new questions about them. I'm trying to show the reader a new way of seeing biological facts." And so the idea of an extended phenotype in Dawkins' book uses 2 or 3 examples, but there's this idea that from the perspective of phenotypes, the beaver's dam is in a very real and functional sense an extension of its catchment area, right? And same with the spider's web, right? Sure, it's outside of what we would intuitively think about as the confines of its body, but from a functional perspective, the spider's web is just a way for it to find prey. And so I think that those kinds of cases and this kind of approach of advocating for a new point of view is very much motivating the work that I'll share with you today. So what I want to advocate for in this talk is a new way of looking at individuals, insofar as individuals are often thought to be the bearers of health and disease states. Right? And so we intuitively think about biological individuals as the sites of medical intervention, right? So that when we're intervening, it's often on an individual. And so what I want to do in this talk is try to make you or help you think a little bit differently and show why the idea of an individual is one that's actually quite contested. It's philosophically interesting, and it's not at all obvious or intuitive. So for the outline, I'll give you a quick tour through the history of the philosophy of medicine and the ways in which philosophers of medicine have thought about canonical concepts like health and disease. And then in the second part of the talk, which is the majority of the talk, I'll look at some research from microbiology and social psychology, which I think challenges this underlying idea of individualism in the philosophy of medicine. And then in the third part of the talk, I'll take those ideas, right, those challenges that I develop, and apply it to the case of obesity, and show how the framework that I develop, I think, gives us new tools for thinking more productively about the debates around obesity. And then, as I mentioned before, I'll conclude in the last section with a discussion about how all this relates to One Health and how One Health frameworks ought to deal with this explosion of interest in artificial intelligence and digital health. All right, so in the philosophy of medicine, going back to at least the 1970s and perhaps sooner, there are taken to be 2 main camps, or two main sorts of theories when it comes to questions about what health and disease are. Okay, so the camp known as naturalism is most famously attributed to the philosopher Christopher Borse, and the naturalist basically says disease judgments, right? What counts as disease? What counts as health? These are objective. They're value neutral, and their recognition is a matter of natural science, not evaluative decisions. Right? The idea of health, he says, ought to be analyzed by reference to physiological medicine alone. Okay, so there's no value judgments, there's no social values, it's just like hardcore naturalist, empiricist, physiological medicine, right? You want to define what health and disease is, you look for deviations from a statistical norm in the population. Right? No value judgments involved, purely statistical, purely quantitative, fully objective. Right? So the classification of human states as healthy or diseased is an objective matter to be read off of the biological facts of nature without the need of value judgments. Right? So it's this very like hard-nosed empiricism. Okay? So then that's kind of one end of the spectrum is naturalism. At the other end of the spectrum is the family of views known as normativism. Right? So normativists like Engelhardt soundly reject that view. Right? And the main counterargument that to many folks is decisive against these views is the case of homosexuality. Right? And so normativist arguments against naturalists often deploy the argument of the case of homosexuality as disease on the idea that like if you were just doing this purely objective, hard-nosed, medicine and classifying diseases is really about objective facts, right? The naturalists would have no way to explain how it is that in 1986 homosexuality was removed as a disease from the DSM-3. Right? So the best way to explain what happened in 1986 is a change in values. Right? There was nothing about, there was no objective data, there was no definitive study that showed this once and for all. The best way we explain that is through a change in social values. Right? So those are the two broad camps. Right? I think it's fair to say that most folks in the philosophy of medicine tend towards the normativist side more than the naturalist side. That's not really important for our purposes. What I want to highlight for this talk, however, is that even though these views are diametrically opposed about how to define what counts as health and what counts as disease, they nonetheless share an underlying assumption that the individual organism is the bearer of those health and disease states. Right? So this is clearly seen in the Borsch book that I cited, same with Engelhardt. Right? We talk about individual survival and reproduction. Engelhardt talks about the function of medicine to secure the autonomy of the individual from a particular class of restrictions. Right? And I say, like, that makes sense. It's pretty easy and intuitive to think about individuals as organisms in that way. But most of the talk today is going to try to convince you that that easy and intuitive way of thinking about organisms is mistaken, potentially, and it limits the range and the strategies of effective interventions that we might develop. Right? It limits our thinking. All right? So what I want to say is that converging evidence from the biological and psychological sciences that I'll give you a survey of is going to challenge that easy intuitive view. Right, at the very least, and at the most, I think it'll allow us to make an argument that that simple individual as organism idea is empirically inadequate. Right, it doesn't stand up to our best science. All right, so now I want to get into some of these, what I'm calling the microbial challenges and the transactive challenges to this intuitive idea of what individuals are. All right, and so after I sort of lay out that challenge, I'll put all that evidence together and put forth what Nikolai in our paper call the hypothesis of extended health. Right? So it's a way to try to accommodate this emerging view from microbiology and social psychology that recognizes that individuals might extend beyond the intuitive boundaries of our skin envelope. Right? So that's the idea, is the hypothesis of extended health. Right? So a short version of what I'll call the microbial challenge to biological individuality goes something like this. Right? By most counts, human organisms consist of around 40 trillion cells. Right? Now, estimates about the number of microbial cells in a human body range wildly. I don't think there's sort of definitive agreement on this, but at the very least, they range at the low end from like a 1-to-1 ratio, right? That there are as many microbial cells as there are human cells, but some estimates put it even higher, like a 2.5-to-1 ratio, right? Where there might be something like 100 trillion microbial cells. Right? And so what we know from decades of research across microbiology is that these organisms are crucial for normal functioning of our digestive, immunological, and psychological systems. Right? The deficits in various kinds of taxa in the gut, for example, are associated with digestive problems, immunological problems, and even psychological problems. Right? So we know that they're crucial for normal functioning. We'll get into some of the debates in a minute about how to interpret causality versus correlation in these studies. But at the very least, right, we know that they're important contributors to human health. Right? Now, once we take seriously that idea that there might be as many microbial cells as human cells in the human body, I think it immediately raises this question of like, well, which individuals are we talking about? Okay, so insofar as a theory of health and disease unreflectively assumes that the individual is just the organism, I think that that theory is going to be subject to charges of being empirically inadequate. Right? After all, to which organisms are these views referring to? Right? If only to the organism containing human DNA, well then it looks like they're missing at least half of the picture. right? So at the very least, views referring to only human cells are going to be at best incomplete, at worst maybe outright false, with respect to these crucial questions about our metabolic, immunological, and psychological functioning. Right? So that's the sort of microbial challenge in a nutshell. And I should say, too, that my collaborator on this, Nikolai, he's more of like the microbiology guy, so I don't feel super comfortable answering those questions, so I'll try. I'm much more like the psychology guy, so I'm more comfortable answering questions about this half of the talk, but I'll take any questions you have. Okay, so next I want to describe to you what I'm calling the transactive challenge to psychological individuals. Right? So maybe some of you are familiar from Psych 101 with this marshmallow test, right? Famously by Walter Mischel and colleagues in the 70s. And this famous psychology study really informs our paradigm cases of the way we think about self-regulation. Right? So for those who aren't familiar, you put these like 4-year-olds in a room and you put one mushroom on a marshmallow. Who knows, but the direction we're going, maybe. But one marshmallow on a plate and say, okay, you can have this now, but if you wait like 5 minutes, then I'll give you 2. Right? And these videos are adorable because you're just like watching these 4-year-olds like squirming and like trying so hard not to eat the one. And like most of them can't do it. The 5 and 6-year-olds are a little bit better. But the idea is it's this canonical test of like how well can you regulate your emotions and your desires, right? So like if you know that you love the marshmallows, you should like impede your desire to have one now so that you get a greater reward later. Right? Now, the problem with this paradigm, which is like, again, one of the most famous and most kind of replicated results in psychology, is that it treats something like willpower, right, the ability to resist temptation, as this very individualistic phenomenon. Right? It treats willpower like we're all sitting in this room by ourselves, like fighting our impulses. And so that's nice, for a psychology design, for like as a way to design an experiment. But I think it's pretty ecologically invalid, and it doesn't reflect the way that most people engage in practices of self-regulation outside of the lab. Right? So I've been interested in some work on what's known as transactive goal dynamics. Right? And these theories in psychology challenge that overly individualistic view about self-regulation. Right? They say a predominant focus on individual level processes, like the kid sitting in the room trying to resist the temptation, that's likely to yield an incomplete and perhaps even inaccurate understanding of the way that people achieve their goals. Right? So this idea of a transactive goal dynamic depicts close friends or relationship partners or social partners as exerting such a great deal of mutual influence on each other's goals, pursuits, and outcomes that the partner's self-regulatory system becomes inextricably linked, part of a complex and messy web of interdependence. Right? And so anyone who's in a romantic relationship and has ever tried to go on a diet, for example, should recognize at least a hint of the insight here. Right? It's not like you want to cook 2 separate meals. Right? So your partner knows what your goals are about eating less carbs or eating more protein or whatever, and like very often they help you pursue those goals. Right? So when they go grocery shopping, they'll buy things that are concordant with your goals and they won't buy things that aren't. Right? And so in that way, our romantic partners, just to take one example, are pursuing our goals for us. And on these theories, they do that in such an interconnected way that it makes sense to think about the relationship itself, right, as a larger self-regulating system. Right? Now, as in a bit of an aside, I have a son who's 2.5, and I was just talking to his preschool teacher, and I thought, oh, man, I know the best evidence actually for this idea of kind of distributed regulation. And it's like if you've ever been in a preschool room and you get really, really stressed out because it's just like chaos of like 15 toddlers running around, throwing things, climbing on stuff they shouldn't be climbing on, and you think like, oh my God, how do these preschool teachers do it? Well, they feel exhausted at the end of the day. Right? And one of the reasons they feel so tired, and one of the reasons most of us find it so stressful to walk into a preschool room is, among other things, 2.5-year-olds don't have fully developed prefrontal cortices. Right? They just don't have the brain structures that we think are involved with self-regulation. And so a very major part of what preschool teachers do is just provide that regulation for the students. Right? And I think parents will sort of recognize this too, right? That like, you have to just do the job of regulating your child's emotions for them because they're not capable of doing it themselves. Okay, so I think all these examples point to the fact of like, if we're just thinking about emotion regulation or self-control in these individualistic terms, we're just missing out on these crucial social dimensions. Right? And so I want to say this isn't just like some philosopher's speculation. Right? In fact, there's an empirical payoff here. Right? So there's evidence that suggests that modeling this goal interdependence the ways in which partners pursue goals for their other romantic partner actually predicts unique variance in relationship outcomes that we care about, right? Like how long are these people going to stay married? How satisfied are they with their relationship? What kind of quality of life do they have, right? Adding in the dimension of those social forms of regulation actually improves predictions and explanations in relationship science. Right? So it's not just this fun idea, but there's actually an empirical payoff to sort of modeling the process of self-regulation in this way. Right? So look, I don't want to say that like individual willpower doesn't matter. Of course it does, right? And of course we can measure that, and of course we can design interventions to improve it. It's just that a myopic focus on individualistic willpower at the expense of these social dynamics and close relationships, I think it renders invisible features of self-regulation that might turn out to be really, really important for understanding how people achieve their goals. Right? So I'm not saying like you can never do the individualist stuff. It's just that if you only focus there, you're missing out on a lot of potential resources. So to sum up so far, right, the short version of the microbial challenge I gave you basically suggested that host and symbiont microbes can be so tightly integrated with our functioning, right, be it digestion, be it immunological response, that it can form what I want to call a dynamic functional unit. Right? And this dynamic functional unit of like, human cells plus microbial cells supports critical processes like digestion and immune response. And this challenges the intuitive view of like a simple, easy, human organism. Right? Similarly, all the stuff I just reviewed about transactive goal dynamics suggests that partners' goals in close relationships can be so tightly integrated as to form one of these dynamic functional units. Right? This supports critical self-regulatory processes and motivation. Right? So again, this idea of like the individual willpower being the thing we're trying to explain is inadequate. Right? We need to look to the social dimension. We need to look to the broader contexts. Okay, so the hypothesis of extended health, as Nikolai and I describe it in a few of our papers, basically proposes that this idea of a dynamic functional unit, that's the thing that is the bearer of health and disease. Right? It's not this intuitive, easy idea of an organism as an individual. It's in fact these dynamic functional units. Right? So when sort of either be they microbial cells or close partners in a relationship, right, things external to the easy, intuitive way of thinking about organisms become so tightly integrated with functioning, right, we say it just makes sense to treat that extended unit as the thing that is healthy, or as the thing that is diseased, or as the thing that you ought to intervene on. Right? So that's all a lot of nice kind of like conceptual ideas. What I want to do now is show that like it actually, I think, does apply and gives us a way to advance classical debates surrounding obesity. Right? So among clinicians, there's long been a consensus that people introduce long lists of interventions about recommendations for obesity, but it's obviously and blindingly clear by now that no single intervention will be successful. Right? There's no silver bullet. And I think even latest developments about Ozempic to the side, I still think it's true to say there's just no silver bullet, right? The required prescription is comprehensive, multi-level interventions. Okay, so what was true almost 15 years ago still holds true today. The time is now, the time is ripe and urgent, more urgent than ever, to implement new multi-level approaches to understanding the basis of the obesity epidemic and how to reverse it, right? So this was a famous, widely cited 2008 review paper. So, my background is in ethics and bioethics, and one of the things that's really striking to me when you go read papers about the ethics of the way people, try to think about or treat obesity, that at least in the ethics literature, the debates about obesity unfold in these very predictable epicycles. Right? So you've got people on the one hand who emphasize that obesity is just primarily a problem of individual choice. Right? People lack the willpower. They lack the self-restraint, they don't have the willpower to diet, they don't get enough exercise, and if people just like pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that's the main problem, right? That obesity is like an individual level problem, right? So that's like one camp. And the other camp comes along and says, no, that's too individualistic, right? And just focusing on willpower, you're ignoring all these socioeconomic structures that constrain people's ability to engage in these processes, right? The fact people live in food deserts, the fact they were advertising, really sugary drinks to young children and making them readily available in schools, right? And so it's these social factors, right, that explain obesity, and it's the social factors that we ought to intervene on. And so it's just striking to me that 30 years of debates about this in the ethics literature, it's like you can pretty much classify most of the papers as falling into one of these two camps. Right? And so, again, what I want to highlight is that these diametrically opposed views about like how we ought to solve the problem of obesity, right? It's individual choice versus oppressive socioeconomic structures, right? Even there, even though they couldn't be farther apart on that, they still nonetheless agree on this underlying view that there's this clean distinction between the organism and the environment, or between individual factors and social factors. Okay, and it's like precisely that clean distinction that this idea of the hypothesis of extended health is meant to challenge, or at least call into question. Right? So what Nikolai and I have argued in a few papers is that this framework of extended health can kind of help to maybe shake us free of this conceptual stalemate in the ethics literature about individual choices versus social factors. Right? It can help us to make sense of what we thought back in 2018, although I'm slightly less confident in now, about emerging sort of microbial interventions to obesity. And importantly, it suggests new sites of clinical intervention. Right? So I'll review some of those. Right, so the pioneering work by Jeff Gordon's lab at WashU is sort of responsible for indicating the central role that gut microbiota play in energy extraction and fat storage. Right, and so this lab and many others around the early 2000s demonstrated the role that these microbial symbionts play in metabolism, vitamin production, preventing infection by pathogenic bacteria, and modulating immune responses. Okay, so these are all, sort of taken as widely understood by now. The paper that often gets cited a lot is the Redur et al. 2013 Science paper, right? And so they take a microbiota transplant, right, a fecal microbiota transplant in an obese twin, and then give an identical diet to a mouse with the gut microbiota from an obese co-twin, right? And shown that given the same diet, that mouse with the gut flora from an obese twin develops greater body mass and adiposity, right? And so the idea is just like there must be something in the makeup of the gut and the microbial communities there and the way they metabolize food that is related to outcomes that we care about with obesity, right? And so in a second condition, they take co-housing condition, right? And given that the mice are coprophagic, right, once they have access to their feces, right, they give a microbiota transplant from a lean twin and find that although it's diet specific, the gut microbiota associated with the lean phenotype, given a high fiber diet, does not. It's protective against developing the higher body mass and adiposity, right? So this was one of the first and most important papers demonstrating the role of the gut microbiome in obesity. I think when I wrote this paper, I was a bit more confident in these findings than I am now. I still think the overall idea holds, but I am more cautious now than I was then about interpreting these data causally, right? So that something like a fecal microbiota transplant could cause weight loss, right? So it may be correlated with it. A lot of the best results I think we see are diet specific. So still, I think it's safe to say that there is a recognized consensus that at the very least, microbiome data significantly improves predictive accuracy for lots of different kinds of human traits, right? Is it going to revolutionize the treatment of obesity like we thought 10 or 15 years ago? Like probably not, right? I don't think that those promises have been cashed in, but I think it's still safe to say that it improves predictions compared to models that don't incorporate microbiome data, right? And so if you take that idea seriously, right, I think that should cause us to question or call into question this kind of conception, right, about there being a clear distinction between organisms and environments, right? So, I mean, a very deep philosophical question is like, are the microbes in your gut, are they part of you as an organism or are they part of the environment, right? Because on the one hand, it's like they're on the inside of you. So you might just think they're, but then it's like a totally different species, right? Totally different part of the tree of life. And then what about the microbes on your skin, right? They're on the outside of you, so like maybe it's part of you, maybe it's not, right? It just sort of challenges this really, really easy way of thinking once we recognize how tightly integrated these are and how crucial they are in terms of lots of functioning related to health, right? Okay, so we're often told, and I want to move to kind of the psychology side, right, that opposites attract. But then you look at all these photos and you're like, I don't know, do they? Like those people look so much alike, it's striking. Right? And then of course, One Health folks will know too that you can find these same effects with people's pets. So this famous 1987 study by Zyank and colleagues, it's just an ingenious study, right? So they collected 2 sets of photographs from 12 married couples. So they have one set of photographs taken of each spouse independently during their first year of marriage, and then they took a second set 25 years later. Right? They then used the between subjects design and gave half the people in the study the young photos and half the old photos. So no person saw both the young and the old. They only saw one side. Right? And then participants were asked to rate the photos in terms of their resemblance and their likelihood of being married. Right? And so in the photographs that were taken after 25 years of marriage, people who were actually married turned out to be rated as significantly more similar and likely to be married. Right? So people who knew nothing about them and never saw an earlier photo were able to predict at above levels of chance like which people were going to be married. Right? And in a follow-up, they actually found that couples who were rated as resembling each other more had greater self-reported happiness, they had a greater frequency of sharing worries and concerns, and they had a higher perceived similarity of attitudes. Right? So what explains these effects? Well, they briefly consider and reject the hypothesis that the convergence of people's appearance over time is due to a shared diet, which is an interesting question. In this paper, they suggest the most likely explanation is the kind of subconscious mimicry that we do. And so that like by constantly mimicking your spouse, you kind of develop some of the same smile lines and same wrinkles. And 25 years is a long time to be mimicking someone. So it makes sense that maybe the muscles in your face would change to reflect the way that you're constantly interacting with them. Okay, so I think this is kind of a cool study that is illustrative of a larger set of findings that are especially important for this case of obesity. Right? So namely that there are dense patterns of reciprocal interactions that are pretty similar to the way I just talked about symbiotic microbes in the previous slides, but this time in the context of social or romantic relationships. Right? So we know from lots of public health research that couples are strongly associated with respect to physical health outcomes, mental health outcomes, and health behavior. So assortative mating accounts for some of this variance, but not all of it. And it's pretty clear that the shared social environment created by relationship partners is a powerful predictor of many health behaviors and outcomes. Right? So in the famous network effects paper by Christakis and Fowler, right, they show that when one spouse develops obesity, the likelihood of the other spouse developing obesity increases by 37%. Right? Again, obviously due to shared diet, shared shopping, right? That's a common explanation. In a meta-analysis of 71 papers back in 2009, researchers found that the second most strongly correlated factor within couples is body mass index. And in a cool 2007 paper, these psych researchers asked participants to kind of give their own descriptions, right? So they didn't give them pre-filled categories. They just asked romantic partners to just kind of jot down their own thoughts about how it is that their romantic partners influence various aspects of their health, right? So no pre-structured categories, just like off the top of your head, what do you think? And the three most influential domains that people self-reported, where their partner was influential on them, were eating, physical activity, and self-esteem. Right? And so anyone who spent any time in the obesity literature, right, will know that these are some of the most studied areas. Right? So people seem to have this meta-awareness of the role their partner plays in health-relevant domains, and they seemed especially attuned in two domains at the heart of obesity research, namely diet and exercise. Right? So what I hope that this kind of whirlwind study of summary of these studies from microbiology and psychology show is that both microbes and romantic partners exhibit these dense patterns of reciprocal interactions in obesity-relevant domains like metabolism, diet, and exercise. Right? And hopefully, you've been convinced by the argument that simple individual as organism distinctions and individual social distinctions about obesity are just inadequate. Okay? And so the idea of the hypothesis of extended health is basically like, we're going to miss out on potential resources or potential sites for intervention insofar as we maintain these simplistic and intuitive dichotomies. Right? So the idea is instead of looking at intuitive ideas of individuals, let's instead look to what we call these dynamic functional units as possible sites of intervention. Right? And so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over, well, I took out some slides about studies I had that suggested there's some payoff here, but one that I can just sort of summarize quickly is that there's a group out of the University of Connecticut that has sort of for the last 10 years demonstrated this really, really striking finding where they take romantic partners and enroll one of them in a weight loss program like Weight Watchers, but then observe weight loss in the second partner. Right? And so I think that they've done this with a number of sort of weight loss interventions, and like the fact that those results show up, right, to me, that's indicative of the kind of approach I want to take, right, is that maybe instead of treating individuals, right, we think about treating the relationship itself, right, the dynamic functional unit of romantic partners. And at least in the case of the interventions they describe in these studies, it's incredibly cost effective, right, because you enroll one person in the program, not two, and you still get these effects. right? Now, the effects in the Weight Watchers study are similar to almost everything else in the published obesity literature, which is that you can see results for 6 months, but almost no results after a year, right? And so that's just a persistent finding that seems to be set in many approaches. But the silver lining for me is that it shows that there is a payoff that's at least as good as the best individual interventions we have that we can get by treating a dynamic functional unit like the relationship as the unit of an intervention, right? And it can be very cost effective to do so. So I'm happy to take questions or hear criticisms about that in the Q&A. But in the time that's left, I'll just sort of briefly connect all this stuff to One Health, right? So one of the first One Health task force papers shows there's growing recognition among practitioners, infectious disease physicians, public health officials, and bioethicists that human health is appropriately understood and only fully supported when it engages animal, human, and ecological health in concert. Okay, so that's an idea that's obviously going to be familiar to everyone here. Early on, researchers claimed that microbiology could play the role of a unifying discipline that's able to effectively take all of these factors into consideration. And so I think that this idea that I've put forth today about this hypothesis of extended health it's very similar, right? They both recognize the foundational importance of interconnection. I think they're fundamentally both about recognizing the inherent limitations of overly individualistic approaches to health and disease. And so I guess to the extent that I have a criticism here, when I was doing my PhD and first reading about these One Health approaches, I thought, yeah, there's something to that, but it almost seemed too nebulous to me, right? I mean, after all, the solar flares on the surface of the sun can have a dramatic impact on human health, but we can't really intervene on the sun, or at least not yet, or at least not in our lifetimes, And so there was this sense that there's a worry that I have about One Health approaches that it's if you make everything relevant to health, then it's almost like nothing is, right? And so this idea of hypothesis of extended health is meant to try to provide a more principled way of putting constraints around that, right? Of not falling prey to this objection everything's potentially relevant to health. And it's well, yeah, I mean it is, right? But then where does that leave you, right? Where do you develop strategies for intervening if every possible thing in the universe could conceivably be construed as relevant to human health? Where do you start, right? It seems like an impossible task. And so the idea of extended health is one that tries to look to these places where we've got these clear criteria, right? What I've been calling these dense reciprocal interactions, be they between symbiont microbes and humans or between romantic partners, as a way to kind of put some constraints on that kind of runaway problem of everything becoming relevant to health in a way that's no longer actionable, right? And so one of the things that I'm most interested in, to hear your perspective on, is the ways in which those kind of reciprocal dynamics that I've been talking about, that are at the heart of this idea of extended health, seem to be increasingly exhibited by technologies, right? And so a lot of philosophers of cognitive science have made, a very convincing argument that at this point, our smartphones are just part of our minds, right? How many phone numbers do you have memorized, right? I mean, almost none. Why? Well, because we've got the reliable presence of smartphone to store those things, right? So some psychologists and cognitive scientists think about that and they say, well, look, we've basically externalized our memory, or at least parts of our declarative memory, to our smartphones, right? To the point that take the smartphone away, the memory performance drops off, right? Same with navigation, right? Don't give people Google Maps, good luck finding your way around a new city, right? And so that, at least in some cases, right, the way that we use smartphones seems to exhibit these kind of dense reciprocal patterns similar to those of symbiont microbes and relationship partners that I talked about, in a way that might suggest that our devices and technology have become so integrated as to be a part of our health as well, right? And so there's kind of obvious and clear examples of this, right? So continuous glucose monitoring, right? So you have the patch on your arm, it's attached to a smartphone, can give you tips about when and where to eat, and so there's a sense in which the technology is very much, we've sort of outsourced the process of regulation to smartphone apps and skin patches, right? And so, hearing aids, pacemakers, right? These are all sort of uncontroversial examples of technologies being so integrated into human bodies that they just kind of take over sort of the functioning. And my own view is that large language models are very much poised to become personalized and individualized and part of our lives in a way that is similarly inextricable, right? So a lot of the latest developments from large tech companies, right? It was often thought that like ChatGPT and large language models were going to revolutionize internet search, right? Well, it turns out when the large language models hallucinate, they're pretty shitty at retrieving factual results from the internet, right? And so almost everyone has pivoted away from generative search, and now the new hot thing in AI is like personalized assistance. Right? So now the latest version of Google's Bard allows you to integrate the large language model with your email, with your slides, with your calendar, and do things like say, plan me a 7-day trip to Paris, right? Where it's looking at your calendar and figuring out what 7 days are going to be good, right? And so I think that the era of AIs as assistants and companions is very much upon us, and one in which health is one of the primary domains where these companies are seeing opportunities for monetization. Right? So I think we are barreling full steam ahead towards a world in which we're outsourcing parts of healthcare to AI, and especially personalized healthcare. And my view is that like a One Health paradigm provides some really nice tools for thinking about the promises and perils of those approaches. Right? As we become, more and more, as companies become more and more enthusiastic about the power of AI to transform health, I think that this conceptual framework proposed by Bennis et al. In a 2018 paper is a nice way of sort of adding in that additional layer, right? So it's, we've got the traditional human-animal environment health, but like my view is that we need to supplement this now with the digital context, right? These tools, these technologies are becoming so integrated with us that One Health ought to be able to take account of that. And I think that in doing that, right, in sort of integrating a sort of digital perspective, it gives us a way to I think about inequalities in the way that these technologies are developed and deployed. And I think that it really will emphasize the importance of thinking about things like the digital divide with respect to health. Right? So I'm happy to talk much more about the sort of integrated AI stuff at the end, but I'll stop now to make sure that we have at least some time for questions. So thanks for your attention.